The following is an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
Hello and welcome to Shaw Community Access Television. 2010 marks the 150th anniversary of the Queen's Own Rifles Regiment of Canada. And celebrating that history, here in the studio today, we have Major General retired Herbert Pitts. Welcome, Herb.
Thank you very much, Al.
Herb, 150 years is a long time.
It is, but it's surprisingly how fast parts of it go. I was serving with the regiment in 1960, which was the 100th anniversary, and here we are at 150 in 2010. And I cannot believe that 50 years have passed between those two anniversaries.
Wow. Well, today we're going to start. The regiment goes back to the 1860s, I think.
1860, yes.
Yes.
April 1860, they were recognized in their present form. They were formed from a number of independent militia companies coming together, and their name when they were brought together was the 2nd Volunteer Rifle Battalion, hence the 2 on our cap badge.
Ah. Well,
still there.
Very interesting. Yeah. From that long ago. And one of the first things they did was defend Canada against some terrorists.
Yes, the terrorists called the Fenians, and they were, by that name, had an Irish connection, and their intention in raiding Canada was to hold Canada, or parts of it, hostage, so that the British would free Ireland from under the imperial yoke. Their attitude was to come and make it easy for the Brits to let go of Ireland. But the 2nd Battalion saved the day. They were one of a number of Canadian units that had been mobilized and sent down there. And
it's the Battle of Ridgeway, was it?
The Battle of Ridgeway, and that was the first engagement of the Queen's Own Rifles of Toronto, as they were known at that time. But the Queen's Own Rifles label was on them.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Well, that was resolved. They obviously were not Irish at this time, but
no,
times have changed.
Yeah, but that's a memorable engagement because we lost 9 people as a result of that particular operation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I understand there's a memorial to some of those folks.
I was back in Toronto in last November for some meetings, and part of that weekend's agenda was to go to a graveyard in Toronto, one of the oldest ones, and to see the unveiling of 3 new markers from people who were buried there. And they were uncovered, unveiled as new granite marble, well-inscribed headstones for 3 of the riflemen who perished there.
Oh my gosh. No, it's after that, their next big thing was the Northwest Rebellion.
Yes, in fact, they got involved twice. In 1870, there was a group sent out to relieve Fort Garry, which had been temporarily seized and held hostage by Louis Riel. He left the scene. It really wasn't a battle as such, but he surrendered and left and went to the States. But in 1885-86, he came back again. This time, the Northwest Rebellion was on for real. So the Queen's Own were mobilized, among other units, and we provided about 230, I think, in that column, which went to Battleford in Saskatchewan to do battle, so to speak, with elements of the rebellion.
My gosh. This all happened a long time ago.
Well, it did, but it's part of our history as the oldest continuously serving infantry regiment in Canada.
Yes. Now, there were a number of famous people at that time. I think Sir John A. Macdonald's son was out there as one of the lieutenants.
I gather so.
As a commander.
I gather so, yes. I don't know how long a family connection it had been, but certainly it was recognized that he was there.
Yeah. And was John McCrae at that one?
No.
He did serve with the unit at some time, though, I think.
Yes, the composer of
Flanders Fields.
Flanders Fields, yes. Mm-hmm. He did. He was he served around the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, mm-hmm. and as a result, of course, he got. He had undertaken medical training after he served with the unit, and ended up then as a surgeon in Flanders. Yeah. And but his connection was in the initial instance with an artillery battery, I think, in Guelph or someplace like that. And then he shifted, I think, when he was going to university, over to the Queen's Own while he was in Toronto.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And another famous person from that time period was Alex Muir, the author of Maple Leaf Forever.
He composed that march, we still use it. It's not the regimental march, which is the Buffs, but it is our marching off march. Whenever we leave a parade, the Maple Leaf Forever is the tune we leave to.
Yeah. Now, an adjutant during the Northwest Rebellion was later General William Otter.
Yes, the first Canadian-born general, and he had quite a long history with the unit, and in fact, as a lieutenant colonel, got involved in the Boer War with what was then called the Canadian Special Service Force. Brackets Royal Canadian Regiment. They were brought together as a unit under I forget the commanding officer's name, but Otter was one of the senior officers in that group, and then went on to command the Queen's Own, and then worked his way up through the militia districts and ended up a general in Ottawa.
Yes. Well, that's really something. A Queen's Own was the first commander of the Canadian Army then.
Yes, I guess you could call it that, although I think there was a very strong British connection in the early 1900s when before I guess our national pride started to exert itself and said we must be more Canadian. We were more or less regarded as an offshoot of the British Army in most of the colonies, which we were at that time, subject to the Imperial Army's training manuals and directions. We were to be part of an Imperial Army if it was ever brought together, and of course shortly thereafter it was in the First World War.
The First World War. So the Queen's Own went to the First World War.
Yes, but not by that name.
I see.
Unfortunately, they went as the 3rd Toronto Battalion.
Yes.
But the men were all drawn from the militia regiment, the Queen's Own Rifles, in the initial instance.
Yes.
Later, they were one of about 6 battalions that was formed basically from Queen's Own recruits.
Yes. And these were, I think all the battalions in World War I were numbered battalions.
They were. None of them carried their original names, and the Queen's Own was rebadged, if you will, to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Battalion.
This must be a challenge when you're looking at battle honors and things like that are important to regiments.
Well, our battle honors are quite extensive, and many of the familiar names of battles in World War I are there. But the battalions, generally speaking, tended to reinforce that 3rd Battalion. Some operated independently, obviously, but the 3rd Battalion was the one that I guess most recognition is given to as having come from the Queen's Own roots.
Now, I understand that one of the people there was General Mercer.
I don't think he was actually serving with the unit, but he had come from the unit at one time.
He'd probably been trained in the Queen's Own.
He was initially as a young soldier.
Yes.
He sort of followed Otter, I guess, along the track that Otter had taken, and he ended up, Mercer ended up commanding the division.
Yeah, I see. So he's commander of the 3rd Canadian Division.
Yes.
And I understand that he believed in fighting from the front.
Well,
he didn't hide behind the
He was killed at the front.
He was killed at the front.
And that was a very widely recognized event, too.
Yes.
As being,
Sorel, I think, in
one of those fellows who was going to lead from the front.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So a glorious history for many.
Yep.
Battalion.
The First World War, of course, is important from a Canadian perspective in that it was the first time that the Canadian units and divisions were brought together to form our own corps, Canadian Corps. Mm-hmm. So the genesis of that is in many of the events which led up to our being committed to battle as parts of Canadian divisions, but under British command, if you will. Well, that was generally centralized to come bring those divisions under Canadian command. And of course, Sir Arthur Currie, who sprang from this area, was renowned as a Canadian Corps commander.
Yeah. Wow. Well, now the quite a few Queen's Own or Queen's Own related soldiers went to war. Some 7,562 was the number that's usually quoted, and a number were lost, and are over 1,400, and they're commemorated at Vimy Ridge.
Yes.
You've probably been to Vimy Ridge.
I've been there twice, Al, and I must say it's one of those places you once see, and in fact you feel almost like you're in some other presence. It is really a very imposing statue. When you begin to look at the names that are carved there, and some of whom you might identify, but even though they seem to be an anonymous list of persons, all of them served this country, and all of them took a part in the history which has brought us to where we are today. Yeah. And a lot of people will say that Vimy gave birth to the nation. Yes. And that monument is something that once seen, never forgotten. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's really marvelous, and thank you for all that. And we're going to go on now. We're going to take a brief break. Yes. And then we're going to come back and talk about the history after World War I. Oh. Okay. And up to more modern times. Yeah. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
You're watching an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
Welcome back to the second section of our program today on the 150th anniversary of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. We're taking a look at the history of the unit with Major General retired Herbert Pitts. Herb, we got up as far as the end of World War I in our first segment, and now I guess we move right along to World War II.
That quickly.
Logical. The unit did very well in World War II. They did a commendable job right from the beginning, well, from D-Day onward. Yeah, I guess the highlight is D-Day. They had been mobilized to garrison Newfoundland at the beginning of the war, and then brought home and underwent some further training and went to England as part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Oh, yes. And needless to say, spent endless months, it seemed, in training schemes of various kinds in England in preparation for D-Day, whenever that was going to come. And as has now properly recorded, the unit was one of the assault battalions of 3rd Canadian Division and landed on the beaches at Normandy about 8:12 a.m. in the morning. So they would be the first across the beach. They were the first wave that went in on landing craft. Yeah. And one of the interesting notes about that is that the two companies that were the assault companies were commanded by brothers. Oh, by gosh. Ellie and Charles Dalton were side by side with A and B Company, I think were the names of the companies. Yeah.
I don't think they raced each other to shore necessarily, but they landed at about the same time on that beach.
I imagine they raced across the beach, though. It was
they probably didn't waste any time.
Quite a scary place, but they were rather famous for their speed at getting across the beach and accomplishing their goals.
Well, yeah, Chester Wilmot, I think, said that, and I haven't got the exact words, but he said if it hadn't have been for the dash of that unit and other Canadian rifle battalions getting across those open spaces, they would never have made it. He said it was a critical factor in the success of D-Day in that area.
Yes.
It's interesting to note that of the 4 infantry battalions that landed, 3 of them were rifle regiments.
Oh,
the Queen's Own, the Winnipegs, and the Reginas. It really is an interesting feature when you take a look at that.
Yeah. And they did very well. There are many famous people that are people who did extremely well in the regiments.
Beside the Dalton brothers, I think were, and they have been almost in a class themselves. They were classy guys and classy officers, and stayed in honorary positions in the regiment after the war. I knew both of them quite well. There was a company sergeant major of one of those brothers, and I can't recall offhand now which one it was, named Charlie Martin.
Yes.
And Charlie was one of the most decorated soldiers certainly in the battalion, but in the Army too, because he won 2 very coveted awards in a very short period of time, having to do with the landing on D-Day and the move inland. He won both the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the Military Medal, and was regarded as a real hero among regimental people, even to the time he passed away, which was only about 5 or 6 years ago. A great character.
Oh my gosh.
An interesting man in that after the war, despite all the dash and the horror, he settled down to a quiet life in Toronto, and he devoted himself to youth and to church. Those were 2 his sort of lifelong core involvements for him.
Yes. Well, even the Padre made some fame there on the beach. I understand that Padre Clow was shot in the foot.
Could have been.
But he didn't get to look at it for a day or 2. And when he finally pulled his boot off the next day, the bullet fell out.
I understand that, yeah. I'm not sure how that would have happened, but that's the story.
Yeah, that's the story. I don't know. I guess he was highly regarded at the time. And there were prisoners of war involved then too, as a few of our men were captured.
Yeah,
in the front lines.
The Queen's Own not only moved quickly across the beach, they were the only regiment sort of in that area that actually captured their inland D-Day objectives.
Yes.
It was a little village called Annecy, and it was about 3 or 4 miles inland. And during that rapid move, I think a section or 2 got separated from their companies, were captured by the Germans, and the next thing were found, 6 of them, had been shot in the head, which in almost identical circumstances and identical places. So the assumption and the conclusion was that they had been executed.
Yes. We would hope that, the Queen's Own took some prisoners as well.
Nothing as much recorded about them, and hopefully it was kind of the normal processing of capturing and returning to positions behind the line and out.